Morning, everybody. Welcome here. My name is John, and I'm part of the pastoral team. And we are in the middle of a 6-week series giving an overview of the big story of Scripture. And I know that there's people who will look at the Bible and go, it's just a little much. It's kind of overwhelming. There's a lot of pages, you know. And what's more, in all of the little stories, what's the main theme? I'm not always catching it. And so this series is really trying to help us understand some of the really big themes that are part of the big story of the Bible. We've talked about creation. I'm glad that our snowflakes here have turned into greenery, especially now in January. We could all use a little more greenery in our lives. But the story of the garden, the story of creation, is the story of God creating us in His own image so that He could have relationship with us. The crazy thing is the damage that we do to relationships now is the damage that we have always done, and we have damaged our relationship with God, and He has been about a long project of restoring us to relationship with Him. So one of the big moves that God made in restoring relationship with humanity was a man named Abram, who we talked about last week, where God said, you and I, we are going to form a partnership to change the world. And I've got promises to make, and you've got promises to keep, and let's do this together, and through the world I will bless you. Today we're going to talk about Exodus. And Exodus is the story of coming out of captivity, because that's something that God does over and over and over again. He pulls us out of the captivity that happens in our own lives. And the story of the Exodus is this grand narrative, this grand event that reminds us that God's in the business of taking us from places of exile and places of slavery in our experience, places where we are prisoners, and bringing us into freedom. And then next week, we're going to talk about how God works through judges and kings, because the people, they didn't want God so much as they wanted somebody like a boss. Somebody who was nearby at hand, who could tell them what to do. And in that process, they asked for judges and kings, and it didn't always go well for them. Because it didn't always go well, and because more often than not the kings made the wrong decision, not the right decision, God sends prophets. Prophets who call us back to Himself. Prophets who remind us who we are and who we're supposed to be. Prophets that kick us in the butt. Prophets that get us back on track, that encourage us when we have lost hope and lost our way. And then there's the story of the Messiah, Jesus, who's the anointed one, the one who comes to solve the problem that began back in the garden of our rebellion, so that we could experience a relationship with God the way He designed and created us to be in relationship with Him. So today, I want you to buckle up, because we are going to go through 4 books of the Bible in 20 minutes. There's some Bibles scattered throughout the seats. You might want to grab one. I would encourage you to take a good look at it for yourself. We are not going to tell most of the stories here. I'll refer to some stories, and you should probably read that one. And dig into it for yourself. But I want to help you understand the big story that is the story of Exodus. The 4 books that we're going to look at are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And you're going, yeah, I've tried reading those. Apart from some crazy, ridiculous events, there's a lot of boring stuff in there. And I want to help you understand what the value of it is so you can build it into your own life in a helpful way. So let's begin with the notion of captivity. But one of the challenges is we all have a kind of captivity in our lives. We call it captivity as a heart condition. And the challenge of the Exodus is that the people of Israel, Abraham's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, they had moved to Egypt because there was a famine in their homeland, and Egypt had lots of food. When they got there, they experienced prosperity. They grew. Economically, they grew from a tribe to pretty much a nation. They overwhelmed Egypt almost with their growth. So much so that the Pharaoh said, we got to put a stop to this. This is a threat to us. And he put them into slavery. In fact, he said that all the male children should be killed as when they're born. Because this Hebrew people was such a threat to the power of Egypt. And the reality was, all of a sudden, the place of prosperity became a place of captivity. Now, this is true not just for the Israelites in Egypt, the Hebrew people. It's also true today. Have you ever had a place of prosperity become your place of captivity? You get that new job, and it's the perfect job, and it's got a great paycheck, and the boss is pretty good, and the coworkers are cool, and and you're really motivated and engaged. And then the company changes hands, and the new administration, not so good, and the co-workers, they become to grumble, and you're not enjoying being with them at coffee break either, and all of a sudden you realize that a place of prosperity has become a place of captivity. Not that things are terrible, but you can't actually see your way to a better future. Have you ever had that experience where you can't see your way to a better future? And all of a sudden, things go from not so good to pretty bad, actually, but you dare not make a move because you can't see another job with a suitable paycheck and a better environment. You haven't got the courage because this is familiar. It's not good, but at least it's familiar. We don't do this just in our jobs. We've also done this often in our relationships. The guys that you play hockey with in high school, great bunch of guys, Monday night football guys, and beer league hockey guys, and you had a fabulous time, great friendships. And all of a sudden, over the years, you get together, and after the game, you're complaining about your families and your wife. And you're whining about your job. And all of a sudden, this great group of guys is mostly bitter and irritated with the lot they have in life. Now, these are your friends, but you can't imagine not being with them, but you really don't want to be with them, and you found yourself in a place of captivity. What was really great, a place of prosperity, has become a place of captivity for you. This happens over and over again, and it's even the way of a party. You really enjoyed the party times and the party people. And you became quite comfortable with the party drink. And after a while, the times have changed, the people have gone, and the drink remains, and you're going, what was prosperity for me, a remarkable time in my life, has become a place of captivity, a place of trappedness and bondage. The crazy thing in our lives is so often the places where we experience prosperity, we find ourselves later on in captivity in those same places. So what's the solution? How do we deal with this real challenge in our lives? Because captivity is not just a condition of circumstances, it's a condition of the heart. And this is how it went for the people of Israel. And we can take major lessons out of this for our own story and experience. First of all, there's a man. There's a person who helps circumstances change, with whom God forms a partnership. In the place of your captivity, I want to remind you that there is a man, there's a woman who will partner with God that will challenge you to change your circumstances. Today, you might be that person who does that for someone else. But the person that God partnered with is a man named Moses. One of those boys that should have been killed. And the midwife said, I'm about bringing life into the world, not taking it out. And I'm not killing this child. And she found a way. It winds up that Moses becomes part of Pharaoh's own household, irony of all ironies. And Moses is raised as a prince in the palace. He becomes a person who over 40 years is schooled in the military arts because he has to lead his people into battle. He's schooled in government because he must govern and lead well. He's schooled in law. He's schooled in the philosophies and religions of the world because he must be a ruler. And then he says, I'm going to go check in on my family and see how they're doing. And he goes back and he discovers that the Hebrew people are deeply enslaved. He sees the abuse and he kills an Egyptian slave driver. Now, he goes from being someone in power to somebody on the run for his life because murder is murder wherever you are. And quickly he's an outcast. He's not welcomed by the Hebrew people because he's a turncoat who was raised in the palace, nor is he welcomed by the Egyptians because he killed one of their own. So he goes to the desert. You might find yourself having desert experiences. Moses' desert experience was another 40 years. Sometimes it takes a long time to get rid of Egypt in our brain. The things that Moses had learned, he had to relearn in a different environment, and he shepherded sheep. He didn't have the tools of power. He didn't have the advantages of the kingdom. He simply had to learn how to lead in the most basic ways possible. And then God called him. And this might be your moment like it was Moses' moment. He had a burning bush experience where he said, this is strange. He went and he checked out this bush that was burning but wasn't being consumed. And he had an encounter with God who said, Moses, Moses. And God called Moses by name and he responded, here I am. If people around us are going to come out of captivity, if we ourselves are going to come out of captivity, it's often going to be because somebody answered God's call and said these words, "Here I am." You see, those around you who are in captivity need you to respond to God's call so that they can make a big move. Or if you're in a place of captivity, you are in desperate need of somebody else saying, "Here I am," to God, so that they got the courage to enter into your circumstances. Now, Moses said, "Here I am," but he wasn't really up for the job. He mostly objected to the assignment. He gave all the reasons why he shouldn't do this. Eventually, God said, "Yeah, I know, you're doing it anyways." Because the thing about a unique, one-of-a-kind encounter with God is you lose a lot of your options after that. He's got a really specific purpose for you, and you better work on that. So Moses goes to the Pharaoh. And there is a contest, because the Pharaoh had set himself up as God in Egypt. And the Israelites were people who were under the rule as slaves of the God in Egypt. And God says, we're going to have a little contest here. I am going to prove to you that I am the real God. And I will prove it both to the Hebrews who have forgotten who I am and the Egyptians who don't believe that I exist. And there's this incredible moment where he says, I've heard the cries of the Hebrew people, and I'm going to bring them out of Egypt. I'm going to bring them into a place of goodness. And he equips Moses with some tools. Miracles of disaster. Now, if you got the gift of miracles, you'd like the miracles of healing. It seems that Moses was given the gift of miracles of disaster. He was about to make the point with the Egyptians that God is more powerful than them. And so there was this match. I'll do this. Oh yeah, we can do that too. And there were plagues of locusts and plagues of frogs and plagues of flies, and it was ridiculous. It was miracles of disaster. Each and every one the Egyptians matched, disaster for disaster, which is a really funny thing if you ask me. If disaster's coming on your land, why would you want to say, oh, I can do that and better? Like, it's making a bad situation worse. But Pharaoh had a stubborn heart. And God said finally, okay, Israel is my firstborn son. And if we're going to go disaster for disaster, I will take your firstborn son's life, Pharaoh, and I will take my people out of your bondage. And he does. And Pharaoh has had enough, and he says, get out of here. And the Jewish people leave. The Hebrews are on their way. And they leave, and it says they plundered Egypt on the way out. They took all the gold with them. Now, it wouldn't be that difficult for us to get from here to Calgary if we decided this afternoon to pack up the car and go. We could be there this time tomorrow. Imagine moving Winnipeg from here to Calgary. That was Moses' task. A nation of slaves larger than Winnipeg moving across a desert. So they head out and they get to a place called the Red Sea. And this is the story of Exodus. Moses leads these people to the shore, and Pharaoh has seller's remorse. He goes, I'm going to get my people back. My slaves are gone. My workforce, free labor, gone. The gold that they took with them, I want it back too. And he goes out, and there's the first big encounter that the Israelites themselves have with a God who keeps them safe. And God takes them through the Red Sea. You see, leaving captivity often requires a dramatic moment. And for the Hebrew people, God opened the sea, they parted through, it says, on dry land, and then God closed up the sea around the Egyptian army and they drowned. I'm sorry, there are winners and losers in life. It's always been the case. There is no thanks for participating trophy. There's winners and losers, and in this story, the Hebrew people saw that their God was willing to and able to protect them. They understood that God is God and God is good for them. In this moment, God set before them a cloud where he was constantly present by day and a cloud of fire where he was constantly present by night. There was no doubt that God was always with them. And they get through the Red Sea, and the first thing they did was they complained. Now, if you've been rescued from slavery, where for 400 years, not only you, but your generations before you have been in slavery, you would think that you would be really grateful after this. And they were grateful for about a week. And they said, where are we going to get food? Where are we going to get water? We're going to die here in the desert. Moses, are you crazy? Because they realized that even the slavery that they were in somehow it was comfortable because it was familiar. And one of the lessons that we have to learn from the Exodus is that prosperity that even turns to disaster is at least comfortable because we understand it and know it. Anyone who's come out of an addiction is profoundly aware that leaving addiction is hard, but there's something very familiar about it that draws you back because you know what to do and how to engage the world in the context of your addiction. The Israelites, they wanted to go back to Egypt, but there's no going back through the Red Sea for them. And now they have a journey where they are experiencing God's goodness to them, and God makes it known over and over again. Even though you complain, I will provide. It's not a bad deal. It's called parenting. Even though you complain, I will provide. And the Egyptians, they're no longer part of the story. You, my children, you complain about food, I give you food. You complain about water, I give you water. I give you everything you need, and yet you are barely grateful. Still true, isn't it? God gives us so much, and we don't learn the lesson of deep gratitude. We just keep whining and complaining. See, the story of Exodus is taking Egypt out of our hearts, and the first and most important lesson to learn is we have to deal with our complaining attitude that is deeply seated in us. It's easier to take people out of Egypt than to take Egypt out of people. It's easier to get you out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of your heart. Same true for me. Got me a bad case of Egypt some days. Got me a bad case of Egypt. How about you? Moses is dealing with people who have a bad case of Egypt, and they get to the Mount Sinai, the place that's called the Mountain of God. And there, Moses goes and he gives the people a new law. Not an Egyptian law, God's law. Not an Egyptian way of life, God's way of life. And in that moment, he writes out in an encounter with God the Ten Commandments. It says that God inscribed on stones of tablet with his own finger the law. And the law is about a new way of worshiping and a new one to worship. The law is about dealing rightly and justly with slavery. The law is about violence and property crime, an ordered society. The law is about restitution so that we restore broken relationships and broken lives. The law is about social justice. It's about better economics. The law is about religious celebration. The law is about rest. You see, slaves are slaves 24/7. There is no rest. And one of the big deals in the law is honor the Sabbath. Take a day of rest. If there's a way that we are still in slavery in a 24/7 world, it's that we don't turn off the phone. We keep answering emails from work on Sunday afternoon, that we busy our lives so full that we don't have time for rest. I'm sorry, God never said because of Jesus, you don't have to rest anymore. Because we have freedom does not mean that we should work with it. Take a place for rest, because rest is a reminder that you are no longer in slavery, and yet so many of us, still today in our work world, we are still in slavery even on a day off. Let me say, give that day to God, and let your employer wait for the call tomorrow. They'll still be there. And guess what? You'll be better for it because you'll be a more productive person because you took God seriously, saying, I want to take slavery out of your heart. We still have slavery in our hearts today, folks, all the time. And the gift of the law is the gift of a new order and a new way of being. And so God moves us from Exodus. In the next 5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to go Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You ready? Leviticus is about a new way of living that revolves around God. You go, I've tried to read Leviticus. It makes no sense to me. Has anybody tried to read Leviticus and said it makes no sense to me? A couple of you have courage. The rest of you haven't read Leviticus at all. Leviticus is about a life that is ordered around who God is. God will take everything in your life and organize it around who God is. So imagine your time being ordered around God. God is the center of the way you spend your time. Imagine your family being ordered around God. God is the center of how you organize your family. Your sex life ordered around God. Imagine that. It might be awkward, but imagine it. Imagine God talking about your paycheck and your economics, ordering everything around God. You see, Leviticus is about a life where everything is an act of worship, where everything places God at the center. And then we move to a story that happens right at Mount Sinai, where God has, through Moses, given him the law and Leviticus, this set of ways of living. He comes off the mountain and he hears that there's a disaster afoot. You see, 40 days up on the mountain, and the people who had come out of Egypt, this is only weeks later, months later maybe, they build an idol. A fake god, somebody to do in the meantime. And this is how the story goes. We find it here. It says, the people, let me get there. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us." Yeah, we're fickle too. Don't blame them. They're doing what we do. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. And Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings. They brought them to Aaron. He took what was handed to him, and he made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And he said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." You see, the crazy thing about captivity is that we actually want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to what was familiar. It was bad, but it was familiar. We want somebody to tell us what to do and how to do it. We want gods all the time. And that's the challenge of the story of Exodus, is taking captivity out of our hearts. Taking our desire for any kind of God instead of a life ordered around a true God. And God just about had enough. This happened over and over again, not just the story of the golden calf, where these people, the people were right at the edge of Canaan, right at the edge of the promised land, and they complained and they whined to the point where God said, "I've had enough. I've had enough of these people." And Moses said, "Oh, but God, I want to remind you of something. They're your people, and you're staking your reputation on them. You're staking your reputation, God, on these people. And if you abandon them now, the Egyptians are going to laugh. Yeah, he's a God with a short attention span. He's a God who's going to pull his people out and leave them in the desert." He says, no. And I think there's a moment that's really helpful for us to know. Because Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers is the period of wandering the desert because of our rebellion. That there are people who plead our case. Do you plead anybody's case? Because their lives have gone to hell in a handbasket. They need somebody to plead their case with God. I believe our God is a gracious and merciful God. That Jesus is evidence of God's grace and mercy. But you and I, we need people to plead our case. My grandmother has pleaded my case in prayer many times, every day. Who are you praying for? Because the story of Exodus is the story of Moses pleading the case for God's people. And in the story of Exodus, God is reminding us that we need to plead the case for each other when we go astray. When we have rebellion in our hearts, we've got bad attitudes in our soul, when Egypt is in our mind. There's somebody else saying, "Oh God, would you remember that they're there? Would you take care of them?" God says, "Okay, I will." But in order to get Egypt out of their hearts, this is the plan. Everybody who remembers Egypt, who was born there, they will never enter the promised land. They will stay in the desert. Only those who are born in the desert, born in the wilderness, who have no recollection of Egypt in their heart, they will get to go into the promised land. It sounds like a pretty drastic solution. It does. But it takes 40 years to raise up a generation of leaders, a generation of people who order their lives around worship with God at the center, where every part of their lives is God-focused. It takes a generation. And And that brings us to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is 3 speeches that Moses makes to a new generation, reminding them of the big story. This is what God has done. This is who God is. This is the plan before you. And now go into the promised land because I am with you. I am with you always. You go, how does that story fit? It's a story of bringing people out of bondage. Jesus said, I have come that they might have life and have it to the fullest. Jesus came to set us free. Jesus came to complete what was started in the garden, what Abraham worked on when he said, and I will bless the world through you, Abraham. What Moses and the people of Israel experienced as Exodus, that's what we experience too when we experience Jesus. Jesus is the one who ultimately, through forgiveness, through restoration, takes Egypt out of our hearts. I want to invite you to consider the blessing that Moses gave to the people. The most powerful blessing because it's a reminder of who God is. It's a reminder that still applies to us today. Hear these words of Moses given by God. Words that Moses gave to all the priests to speak every day. May the Lord bless you and keep you. And may his face shine upon you. May he lift up his countenance and be gracious to you and give you peace. It says, say this every day so that people will know that I am God. God wants to take you out of Egypt too. But it means that you and I need to get Egypt out of our hearts. So I promised you Q&R time, except I clearly didn't cover 4 books very well in 25 minutes because it was more like 30, which means I kind of stole a bunch of time. So we probably only have time for 1 question, Carmen.
Time
Sorry.
for 1 question. Okay. Oh, now you're putting me on the spot. Now I have to think. Let's go with this question, and I think that it can be expanded to further. The question is, how will putting God before my family make my family life better?
How would putting God before my family make my family life better? Okay, putting God before your family doesn't mean you abandon or neglect any of your responsibilities to love, cherish, and provide. It doesn't mean you neglect any of your responsibilities to instruct and teach and raise your children up well. It doesn't stop you from being faithful. In fact, making your family not something that you worship, but something where God is the center of, in fact, makes your family experience God together with you. When you put your family first and leave God outside the circle, that's a real problem because all of a sudden you forget that who God is in your life.
And this can be applied to friends or work.
That's right. So let me just give you an illustration. I'll call this the classic hockey dad problem. What do I do when I want my children to succeed in the sports that they're involved in? I give them every opportunity. I get them into club volleyball or I get them into whatever, which is cool when they're 9 years old, but all of a sudden they're 11 and 12 and 13, and it's demanding more and more of their time and life. And in fact, it's competing with their being involved in Christian relationships with other youth at church on Friday night, or being part of Sunday morning because there's constantly tournaments or games during a time when we would gather to worship and learn together. And what I start doing is I start placing my children's success above my children's experience of God. And I've got the classic hockey dad problem, which is maybe an answer to the question, what do? We say, what does it mean for me to place God in the center of my child's growing experience? And I believe that your children can experience excellence and have a life centered on God at the same time. We do not need to buy the lie of our culture that means we have to sacrifice everything in order to experience success. God says, no, experience me and I will prosper you. And that's, I think, the challenge for us.
Thanks, John.
So we got a couple of minutes for some questions. I have an apology to make to Paula, who's running media, because I was all over the place, but I had fun with it. The first time I was really well organized, but it was well
question. So if we don't get to yours, I apologize, but come and talk to us afterwards. First one, how do we start to take the Egypt out of our lives when the Egypt is part of our foundation and removing it only feels like it weakens the structure of our lives?
It's exactly the problem that Egypt had, or the Israelites had, right? It was their foundation. In the absence of it, the structure was gone. It's not enough to take Egypt out of our lives. We actually have to build a new structure, a new foundation. And that's why Leviticus is so important. A structure where God becomes central. And if you are so committed to your work that you're a workaholic, the idea of less work is terrifying. What does it mean to do two things? One is to make God the reason you work. And what does it mean for you to take a place where you do other things and you teach yourself that work isn't your God? You don't find all your meaning there. And so you actually have to create an alternate structure, and one that would be centered in the biblical story, not centered in just because we can actually substitute Egypt for anything. It doesn't have to be the Bible. It doesn't have to be God's word. We can, with good intention, choose the wrong place to go when we try to get Egypt out of our hearts. So part of it is making sure we choose a biblical foundation for that.
Okay, we're going to go for one more. Does praying for someone really change God's mind? How does God, who already knows the beginning to the end, have his mind changed?
Okay, the number of times, if you want to answer this question, read Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because God has his mind changed a number of times. Moses argues with God, and God, it says, changes his mind. We have this idea of God that I think is just a little too neat and tidy. We've taken all the personality out of God and making him so predictable and saying he never changes his mind. Well, the Bible says he does. Which means that prayer matters. Because it's a conversation with a God who, while he is good, does not decide things at the beginning and then just let the movie play out. He's not a script writer that is deterministic. He says, you have choices, you are actors and players in this, and you will make moves that don't impress me or delight me. And God will be involved in the story, which means that prayer is about moving God's attention constantly. And I believe God changes his mind. And if in your circumstances you want God to move, then pray, because God changes circumstances in your life, but also God, I believe, changes his mind on things. He's not a puppet master. He's engaged in a relationship.
Thanks, John.